Episode 34, Tang Hao, the first martial arts historian. Exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. That's what Kung Fu Podcast is all about. And I'm your host, T.W. Smith. This episode on Tang Hao, the first martial arts historian, was published initially in March of 2015. Since that time, I've gone back. I have edited parts of it and revised pieces of it and made it available for those of you who are supporting the program. There are also a couple of extras that were never there a few years ago when I recorded this. For example, now there is a full quiz on the webpage that allows you to go through the amazing facts that you're going to hear about in Tang Hao's story. If you would like to continue to support this program, which I would greatly appreciate, go to kungfupodcast.com/support. Before we go into the original recording of the episode, let me ask you, as a practitioner of any martial art, are you willing to draw a line somewhere? Face ridicule, insults, even physical pain or torture to stand up for what you believe not only to be true, but what you know is right. That was the kind of man and martial artist that Tang Hao was all about. So get yourself ready and let's listen to Tang Hao's adventures and his amazing story. So let's talk about Tang Hao. I pulled this episode together with three sources, and Ben over at Kung Fu Tea was the primary source. I have linked to his original articles here in the show notes and on the website, so you can always get over there and read the original if you want. Tang Hao is not a familiar name to many traditional martial artists. Few people have had more profound impact on the way that we write and think about these hand combat systems than Tang Hao. He was a lawyer by training and as a profession. Tang Hao was the first individual to undertake a serious and sustained investigation of the history of the Chinese martial arts using modern documentary and field research methods. Prior to his time, and he was born in 1897, the Chinese martial arts had lacked a historical perspective. History is more than just an unchanging list of cosmically given names and dates. It is a type of ongoing conversation that information is passed on and transmitted through the communities. History always has a value. Even if the investigative analyst has no political or ideological leanings, the very act of giving people different tools for understanding the past also grants them new ways of thinking about and arranging the present. Tang Hao was very aware of the transformative social power of all well-written historical research. He was counting on the impact of this research. Tang had an ideological lean to his research, and in an era when so many other martial artists were literally taking up the sword for the defense of the nation, Tang was instead picking up his pen. Much of what we currently know, both in Chinese and in English, about the life of Tang Hao comes from a memorial essay written by his colleague and friend, Gu Luising. Gu is the vice director of the Shanghai Physical Education Research Institute when he wrote this account some years after his friend's death. Given the type of exercise, the highly sensitive nature of some of the political issues that Tang Hao's life touched on, and the years that had already passed, we must treat this account with caution. As Kennedy observes in the Chinese martial arts training manuals, some of the most interesting elements of Gu's account are in the silences and the mysteries that he leaves behind. Tang Hao, also named Tang Fang Sheng, was born in 1897 at the Jiangsu province. Jiangsu province is on the east coast, just above Shanghai. Tang was born into poverty. The ghost of reoccurring bouts of poverty would haunt him throughout his life. His family made a living by doing piecework sewing. It seems that at first, young Tang was able to attend school, but was forced to quit as a teenager for economical reasons. While acknowledged as a deeply learned individual, his friend Gu reports that Tang was basically self-educated. Much about Tang's early adult life remains to be clarified. Sometime after leaving school, the young man apparently made his way to Shanghai seeking opportunity. This would have likely been at 20 years old. What he found was Liu Jinnan, an instructor in Lui He Ba Fa, the Six Harmonies boxing. Interesting, Liu Jin had some connections with the educational world. In addition to his own school, which was called the Chinese Goshu Study Institute of Shanghai, Liu Jin was an instructor at Jiaotong University. This brush with the educational establishment, whatever form it took, was fortunate for the young Tang Hao. Gu notes that by the early 1920s, he had been named the principal of the Shanghai Shanggong Elementary School. Let's take a little look at this mystery here. How did Tang Hao go from being a poor rural youth with a very little formal education to a school principal in such a short time? All of this is happening at the height of the Jingwu movement, when a number of local schools were hiring martial artists to teach physical education classes. Now, there's more on the Jingwu Association and Kung Fu Podcast number 9. Links will be in the show notes. It is possible that this was how Tang Hao got his foot in the door. After that, his natural studious nature and extreme work ethic would have been enough to ensure his success. If this is so, then you can count him in as yet another example of a rural youth who successfully turned to the martial arts as a means of social advancement and mobility. Tang Hao continued his association with the martial arts after attaining steady employment. Gu notes that even the local opera troops were impressed with the displays of kung fu put on by his young students. Tang Hao himself also developed an interest in a number of other martial arts, including Xingyi Quan, where he was taught by Li Kunyi, and Tai Chi Quan, where he was taught by Qin Fa Ka. The first reference to Tang Hao as a noted public figure is in 1923. Interestingly, it only had very little to do with his background in martial arts. Instead, this incident illustrates the respect that he had gained as a mainstream educational thinker. Andrew Morse had documented at some length the importance of the YMCA movement in bringing Western amateur sports into China. In fact, the YMCA officials seem to have organized and even led the delegations of Chinese athletes sent to various international sporting events and competitions. This situation was tolerated in the 1910s. Yet, in the more politicized and nationally aware 1920s, this arrangement with the YMCA became unbearable for the Chinese athletic community. Things really came to a head in the early 1920s when Chinese athletes wanted to boycott a set of regional games that were being held in Japan for political reasons. However, the head of the athletic commission, a missionary and YMCA director, insisted that such behavior was just unsporting. Not only did he send a team, but he personally led the Chinese delegation. The sight of the Chinese athletic team being led by a foreign missionary in a supposed national sporting competition resulted in ridicule and boos by the Japanese spectators. It was also felt to be a humiliation, and this they could not stand for back in China. In 1923, a new body named the Chinese Athletic Association was formed to take control of the situation and to ensure that this did not happen again. Tang Hao was one of the educators who was appointed to oversee this effort. A number of martial artists were also selected for the board. But Mr. Morris points out that Tang Hao was not among their numbers. Instead, he was selected to represent the traditional educational establishment. The 1920s were a defining period for Tang Hao. While he became increasingly outspoken, certain questions remain about Tang Hao's political and ideological commitments. Kennedy, in his book, are silent on the question of Tang Hao's political affiliation. You might want to note that Tang was arrested for being a communist with surprising frequency. It seems that many of the individuals that he associated with later in the 1930s were either communists or were perceived as enemies of the state by Chiang Kai-shek's wing of the Nationalist Party. The first incident occurred early in 1927. Of course, this was when the Nationalists retook Shanghai, and in a surprise turn, Chiang Kai-shek sought to purge his party of its communist wing. The end result was the Shanghai Massacre, in which the communist soldiers and suspected party members were rounded up and executed. During or shortly after this event, Tang Hao was also arrested on suspicion of being a member of the Communist Party. As Frederick Waitman has documented in his book on policing Shanghai, and you can find the links there in the show notes, and Spy Master Da Li's Secret Service, very bad things often happen to those who were accused of being a Communist Party member, either because of his public stature of the quick action of a well-connected kung fu brother. Tang Hao seems to have been spared the worst of it. Zhu Guofu, a fellow student of Liu Jinnan, as well as an accomplished wrestler and Western boxer, brought his family to Shanghai and promised them as a bond against Tang Hao's release. At this point, Zhu and a number of associates decided that it would be best if Tang avoided further trouble by leaving the country. They arranged for him to visit Japan, where he studied political science and law. Of course, this also gave Tang Hao a chance to observe the Japanese method of integrating martial arts instruction directly into the mainstream educational institutions of the day. Like many other Chinese visitors during the period, he was deeply impressed with what he saw. This trip seemed to have been the start of Tang's career as a public intellectual within the field of martial arts, rather than simply education. Kennedy notes that while in Japan he studied Pi-sa, which is a type of modern bayonet in sword sparring. Pi-sa is called Jukindo in Japanese. Other accounts state that Tang also studied Judo and Kendo, but Ben states that he was not able to verify those sources. One of the most important things to note about Tang Hao's temporary stay in Japan is its brevity. Tang could not have arrived in Japan before the summer of 1927, and he left for Nanking after receiving an intriguing job offer in the summer of 1928. While he is often referred to as a Japanese-educated lawyer, one wonders how many semesters of classwork he actually managed to complete in Japan, given his other responsibilities. Though Tang is remembered today almost entirely for his scholarly contributions, it is fascinating to note that this year abroad in Japan is the only formal higher education that Tang Hao seems to have received. One of the Republican government's first orders of business as they expanded their borders northward was to establish their own martial arts training program. It was hoped that his new institution would promote martial development in schools and among the people with the aim of improving the nation's health, while at the same time unifying it resolutely behind the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek. Whereas Jing Wu had focused on promoting a culturally bounded sense of nationalism, this new project called the Central Goshu Institute was more state-centric in its focus. Unfortunately, the initial organizational structure that was created divided between Shaolin and Wudong departments, and they split into competing factions and imploded almost immediately. So in the summer of 1928, the Institute was reorganized. New groups of individuals were brought in. Among these were such level-headed educational professionals as Tang Hao. Newly returned from his tour of Japan, he was appointed the section chief for editing and reviewing of the publications division. It is hard to imagine any job that Tang Hao would have been better suited for. It is interesting to stop and question why he was even offered the position, though. He was offered a job by a regime that had recently jailed him on suspicion of being a communist. And while Tang Hao would go on to become the most important martial arts historian of his generation, at this point, he had not done any of that work. His most significant work was going to be done in the future. It doesn't appear any of his research that he is currently remembered for had actually been published prior to his appointment at the association. Once again, his colleague Gu maintains his silence on these questions. If his new colleagues were expecting great things from Tang Hao, they did not have to wait long. In 1930, he arranged an expedition back to Japan for his fellow Institute members who were all noted martial artists and wrestlers. Gu states that the supposed purpose of this trip was to survey the progress of the Chinese martial arts styles in Japan. Yet you can also suspect that the delegation was probably just as interested in seeing the Japanese models for themselves. Upon returning from his mission, Tang Hao presented his findings to the Institute. He then published them in the National Martial Arts Unification Monthly magazine. In these remarks, he laid out what would become hallmarks of his approach to the martial arts. Specifically, he called on the Chinese hand combat community to focus on the development of more practical or combat military relevant aspects of the Chinese martial arts. Given the state of the Japanese martial arts in the 1930s, it is easy to imagine that Tang Hao was deeply impressed by what he saw a government-sponsored Budo. This call for practicality went well beyond the technical applications of the martial arts. Kennedy notes repeatedly that he was just as interested in applying the same emphasis to the historical and theoretical study of the martial arts. Tang despised what he considered to be the fake and ungenuine spirituality and mysticism of the Republic-era martial arts. Tang relentlessly attacked the shaky lineage claims and propensity towards secrecy that could be seen in so many of these new popular styles. The martial arts were to be a vital part of training soldiers and defenders of the nation, not opera performers, temple troops, or folk masters. This basic set of assumptions seems to have bled over into how he viewed the many social locations of the martial arts. The social value of their supposed martial function was clear, but when looking at the practices of street performers, temple troops, traditional doctor, or even the historical significant millennial uprising of the 19th century, it does not appear that he saw much that was legitimate. At best, the role of the state was to reclaim the martial arts from these sorts of actors and the last 100 years of their degradation. These sorts of lower-class practices are either ignored or criticized. But Tang Hao doesn't really attempt to understand how the martial arts functioned within or reinforce these other institutions within the Chinese society. This brings up a number of important points that need to be considered when evaluating Tang Hao's work and his findings. Almost all of the larger points that he made were absolutely correct and are still the basis of our historically accurate understanding of the Chinese martial arts that we have today. Bodhidharma did not bring Kung Fu to Shaolin, and Taoist fairies are probably not the best explanation of the internal martial arts. Nor does it appear that Tang Hao ever intentionally distorted the facts that he reported, not even once. Tang Hao's passion and integrity to the martial arts can't be questioned. This is precisely why his work is still consulted and discussed by historians today. Now let's move to the 1930s. Tang Hao's entire adult life was characterized by a truly remarkable faith in the power of the traditional martial arts to transform and liberate the Chinese people, even in a time when the country was riveted by both civil war and international occupation. But before this transformation could happen, his followers needed to see martial arts for what they really were. Throughout his many writings, Tang Hao sought to liberate Chinese martial heritage from the social constructed framework that had risen around in the late Qing and early Republican period. And much of this is noted in Kung Fu Podcast number 29. Tang demonstrated that the origins of these fighting systems lay in the historical military exercises rather than revelations from the Buddhist saints or Taoist immortals. Tang sought to crush the secrecy and the false lineage claims that have always dominated the traditional hand combat systems. Most of all, Tang wanted his followers to understand that while uniquely Chinese, the martial arts were an ultimately rational and practical system of physical culture that should be revived and placed at the disposal of the state. Of course, the vision that he articulated bore almost no resemblance to how the martial arts were actually being practiced or even discussed in general Chinese society at the time. The various reform movements of the 1920s and 30s, such as the Jingwu and Goshu associations, did resemble Tang's vision of a modernized, yet at the same time restored branch of Chinese physical culture. Yet this approach tended to be confined to the educated and middle-class circles in China's leading cities. The martial traditions of the majority of the population around the country were much more so-called traditional in orientation. They were comfortable teaching with their creation of myths, legendary temples, and secret lineages. Nor did most martial artists appreciate Tang Hao's gift of rational history. Tang's unveiling of their manufactured myths would easily be perceived as threatening to their profits. You, as a historically informed follower, will already know that most of this so-called traditional approach wasn't even that old. The stories that they were using were drawn on older stories and myths. Yet as Thomas A. Green, Stanley Hennings, and many others have already reminded us, most of these myths were invented traditions. Few of these martial systems emerged from the last half of the Qing dynasty. Most of these systems were actually much younger than that, and the lineages were totally manufactured. The great irony is that many of the traditions that Tang Hao sought to debunk were in fact not that much older than his own personal view of history itself. Nor did these stories arise in a vacuum. As we have already discussed in a number of places, in addition to their immediate commercial benefits, this folklore also had important social and cultural ramifications. These stories sought to tell martial artists who they were, and to situate their practice against a rapidly evolving drama of nation building and imperialism. Tang Hao must have known at some level how recent most of these myths that he argued against were. He must have realized that these stories were promoting a vision of the martial arts and that their relationship with society was diametrically opposed to the ideological causes that he had dedicated his life to. Still, in the perpetual upheaval that was the Republic of China, it was probably more effective to argue against the superstitions of the past than to admit that there might be more than one model of how the state and society should relate to each other. Given the overwhelmingly historical nature of his writing, it is easy to assume that Tang's ultimate goal was to somehow liberate the Chinese martial arts from a recently decayed past. If this was his goal, it would be easy to understand why his work generated the opposition that it did. In reality, his conflict was with the present. The early 20th century saw not one, but two reform movements within the Chinese martial arts. One of these was an elite-led project focused on nation and state building. The Jingwu and Central Goshu Institute, as well as post-1949 Wushu, all grew out of this impulse. The other reform movement was happening at the local level across China, as individuals with martial art backgrounds looked for new ways to monetize their skills. The rhetoric of these dissimilar groups also strongly favored the emerging idea of a national consciousness. This national vision of the martial arts was both market-mediated and sought freedom through a renewed vision of the past. While reformers that were backed by the state appeared to have loved nothing more than to express their opinion on the ultimate demise of the Chinese martial arts, the truth is that the martial arts had never been more popular than during the 1920s and 30s. Unfortunately for reformers like Tang, it was the market-driven discourses of lost lineages and secret techniques that was rapidly winning out. It was this alternate vision of China's martial future that he sought to deflate with his historical pen. In doing so, he managed to stir up more popular opposition than one would think possible for an author writing on such arcane topics. In short, Tang's pursuit of truth was really bothering some folks. Tang Hao's first landmark study was also released in 1930. This book was titled A Study of Shaolin and Wudong, and it was published by the Central Goshu Academy. Within its pages, Tang Hao boldly set out to gore as many sacred cows as possible, all in the name of reclaiming the martial arts as a national and potentially modern aspect of Chinese physical culture. Tang advanced critical arguments, which still influence scholarship today. He exposed the weak foundations of Shaolin and Tai Chi's most popular creation myths. While intellectually sound, Tang Hao's efforts did not find an entirely receptive audience. Indeed, this one volume seems to have accomplished the impossible. It brought together the separate and feuding factions of the traditional community in one united dislike for Tang Hao and his historical criticisms. What's that old saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend? It's not entirely clear of how much support Tang Hao received from his employer on whose behalf this volume was published, But Gu reports that Tang Hao's criticism engendered enough hostility that a group of traditional practitioners in Nanjing were basically conspiring to run him out of town. Once again, his Kung Fu brother, Zhu Guofu, stepped in to clear the matter up. After meeting with the aggrieved parties, he arranged a deal by which they would agree to back off, and Tang Hao later left town on his own accord. Given the very real political clout of the Goshu establishment, one wonders why things were allowed to escalate to this point. Why was it necessary to bring an outsider to arbitrate? Why didn't the Institute fight harder to keep their prized scholar? Once again, Go sidesteps these rather obvious questions. It is dangerous to guess about these historical issues, but still the Central Goshu Institute was actively appropriating certain elements of Chinese traditional martial heritage, and the dividing line between the reformers and the traditionalists was occasionally a fuzzy one. One wonders if perhaps Tang Hao's 1930 barrage alienated some of his employers as well. Following his departure from Nanjing, he returned to Shanghai. There he put his newly acquired education to good use, and he began to practice law. The period from 1931 to 1941 was probably the most productive of Tang Hao's life in terms of original research and writing. Go recounts that during these years, he became a practical hermit, dedicated only to his writing. Still, when he did emerge from his study, he managed to get caught up in interesting and potentially dangerous events. Tang Hao also pursued his interest in the martial arts during these years. In 1931, he organized his own local group called the Shanghai National Goshu Anti-Japanese and National Salvation Association. Gu himself joined this group, and this is when his relationship with Tang Hao was really forged and strengthened. The formation of this group seems to have been a result of the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in the same year. In 1932, Tang Hao and Chen Ziming undertook the difficult trip to Chen Village, where through both archival and field research, he would do some of his most important work on the history and evolution of Tai Chi. This work is still referenced in any serious discussion of the origins of Tai Chi. As concerns about Japanese imperialism mounted in the late 1930s, Tang Hao redoubled his efforts to promote the martial arts, and Pi Sa in particular, as a training tool for the Chinese military. By 1936, he had his own organization drilling in the more modern sword and bayonet methods, and he was busy trying to develop different sorts of training equipment. That year also saw the publication of at least 4 more essays. The coming Japanese invasion was another turning point in Tang Hao's life, though perhaps not of the sort that any would suspect. In 1936, a number of individuals who were associated with Tang Hao formed a national salvation group and demanded that the KMT government put aside their long-running civil war with the CCP and unite to face the Japanese. This incident inspired a strike at a Japanese spinning factory in Shanghai. Chiang Kai-shek responded to the group's demands by having them and their associates imprisoned. These events became known in the press as the 7 Gentlemen's Incident. Gu was one of the 7 arrested, and though he was later granted bail, Tang Hao functioned as Gu's defense lawyer and continued to visit and counsel with the other gentlemen who remained behind bars until 1937. This was a very important and highly publicized event. Students across China demonstrated in solidarity with the 7 gentlemen. Madame Sun Yat-sen even traveled to Shanghai to conduct a sympathy demonstration where she demanded to be arrested on the grounds that the only real crime that the group had committed was to be patriots. Not surprisingly, Chiang Kai-shek saw things differently. He was very concerned about anything that increased public sympathy for the Communist Party, and he accused the gentleman of endangering the Republic, which is a very serious charge. Despite his prior problems with the government, Tang Hao stayed in Shanghai to act as defense counsel. He and Gu even managed to bring their new and improved PSA training equipment into the prison to do a little bit of training with their friends and associates. Shanghai was ultimately overrun by the Japanese in 1937. Rather than fleeing the city, Tang Hao opted to stay and continued to work as a lawyer throughout the occupation. He had a number of important books, including his edited collection of Qing-era archery manuals, published in 1940, and still he managed to stay intellectually active even though he was dogged by political problems. In 1941, the Chinese civil administration of the city, working under the Japanese occupation, sought to once again arrest Tang Hao on suspicion of activities or membership in the Communist Party. Tang Hao was tipped off about the imminent arrest by a well-connected local merchant, and he went into hiding in a rice warehouse. This is where he finished his work on the study of Shaolin and the Secret Lessons, a book to disprove the very popular Shaolin manual that had been published in 1915. And this is the same book that Robert W. Smith republished in English, titled The Secrets of the Shaolin Temple Boxing. This volume was quickly typeset and published in 1941 by the Shanghai Modern Book Company. Shortly after the release of this volume, Tang made a critical error in judgment. He became convinced that the police were no longer interested in him, and so he returned home. After arriving, he was incensed to discover that his precious files and research materials on the martial arts had been partially destroyed by rats. He blamed his wife for this loss, and she responded by hanging herself. Gu reports that Tang was devastated by his wife's suicide. Yet things were about to get much worse. While the civilian police had lost interest in Tang, it seems that the Japanese military had not. Shortly thereafter, he was arrested by the Japanese military police and subjected to torture as part of his integration about his affiliation with the communists. Gu reports that upon learning of his friend's arrest, he approached a highly influential factory owner who was able to intercede with the Japanese and secure Tang Hao's eventual release. After being let go, Tang fled, and he later settled and remarried. He moved back to Shanghai after the city's liberation from the Japanese, and while he continued to work on various projects, he was not as productive in this final period of his life as he had been in the previous decade. He completed several works, and he seemed to have transitioned easily following the 1949 liberation of China by the Communist Party. Unlike so many other martial artists who had worked with the KMT during the 1930s, he felt no need to flee to either Taiwan or Hong Kong. In fact, Tang Hao eventually found steady employment with the new regime. In 1955, he was appointed to the Commission of Sports. This afforded him the opportunity to continue his massive research project on traditional Chinese sports and physical culture. That effort eventually resulted in the 8-volume History of Chinese Martial Arts and Sports. On January 20th, 1959, Tang Hao died in his apartment in Beijing. Go reports that he had remained immersed in the study of his beloved martial arts right until the very end of his life. I hope you enjoyed learning about the amazing story, the adventures, and the type of cultural man that Tang Hao was all about. He contributed to and fought for the well-being of others. He made an effort to do what he believed was right. His work as an attorney of the law, as a martial artist, and as a researcher of history and technical applications of martial arts had an impact not just in the 1930s, and not only in perhaps the most volatile time of Chinese history, but he still makes an impact to this very day. Because of the integrity of his work, Tang Hao is referenced by institutional scholars around the world. I'd like to say thank you to Ben Junkins over at Kung Fu Tea. You can find his work at kungfupodcast.com/Ben. Exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. This is T.W. Smith, and I greatly appreciate you listening to this episode today regarding Tang Hao. I hope you have a fantastic practice, and remember that if you get out there, and regardless of the reasons that you practice, whether it's to improve your self-protection skills, whether it's to improve a philosophical way of life, improve your health, it doesn't matter. As long as you know what you're practicing for and those are in line with what you're doing, you're good to go. If you'd like to support this program, go to kungfupodcast.com/support or head on over to the webpage, kungfupodcast.com/donate. Tang Hao, TANGHAO, and take the quiz of the information I just shared with you. Talk to you soon.